Okay, well thanks everybody for coming to the second of our 2025 speaker series. If you weren't here last time, our series this year is themed around the idea of hearth and home. So kind of coming from the mindset that Juliet Kinsey, who lived in that house next door in the 1830s, spent her entire life growing up on the East Coast, and when she married the Indian agent who worked here in 1830, started coming up the Fox River here to Portage. It was like her coming to a foreign country, a place where everybody's speaking different languages, different lifestyles, even people of her own culture had different ways of going about life. So basically a whole new world for her to become familiar with. For her it was not a formal process of learning about the people around her. The process of learning about all the different people groups around her was done in the setting of the hearth in the home, sitting around her own hearth with people of different backgrounds, learning about them, sitting around other people's hearths as she's traveling. So anyway, we kind of thought that was a unique way to learn about other cultures just by being one. And so this year is, our theme is just to kind of learn about other cultures through the same way, learning about the daily rhythms of people of the past and helping us get a better appreciation of people today. So tonight's presentation is on archaeology at Fort Crawford. The archaeology there, you're figuring out where buildings were, that kind of thing, but the stuff in the ground is also telling you a bit about the lives of the people there. We're sitting right across the river from Fort Winnebago here at Portage. Whether it's Fort Winnebago, Fort Crawford, the life experiences of soldiers is going to be pretty much the same. So as we're thinking about the life experiences of soldiers through archaeology at Fort Crawford, we're also thinking about the experiences of people here at Portage 200 years ago. We're honored to have Vicki Twinde-Javner from the Mississippi Valley Archaeological Center, affiliated with UW-La Crosse. She's a senior research archaeologist there who's involved with these excavations, and glad to hear from you.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm Vicki, Vicki Twinde-Javner with the Mississippi Valley Archaeology Center at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. So, as Adam mentioned, I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about 2nd Fort Crawford. So, as a lot of you are aware, 2nd Fort Crawford is located in Prairie du Chien. So, Prairie du Chien is located near the confluence of the Wisconsin and Mississippi rivers. So, of course, being close to that confluence, people were in Prairie du Chien for thousands of years. You had pre-contact Native Americans, you had historic Native Americans, lead miners, settlers, Euro-Americans, the military, all kinds of people came to an influx into this area. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our excavations at the fort, and then I brought a few snippets from the National Archive work that we did, a few daily things that the soldiers would have done, and show you some of the wonderful artifacts that we have. So in July of 1999, the MVAC, or the Mississippi Valley Archaeology Center, was contracted by the Wisconsin Department of Transportation to monitor deep water and sewer trenching in Prairie du Chien, along Beaumont Road and Prairie du Chien. So, Beaumont Road is located right here, and this today is the Fort Crawford Museum. It's the old surgeon's quarters, or the old hospital. So some of you are shaking your head, nodding your head, it sounds like you've been there. And so, basically what they were going to be doing, they're putting a new water main right up along here. And so Beaumont Road is named after Dr. William Beaumont, who had done a lot of work with the digestive system. Some of you might have heard that story. He was served at actually first Fort Crawford, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But Dr. William Beaumont actually worked with a gentleman who had gotten shot in the stomach, and his skin never properly healed. So Dr. William Beaumont put on a string pieces of meat for months and recorded different times of how that digestive system works. So it became a very prominent book for surgeons. So first Fort Crawford was located near the lower part of Prairie du Chien on St. Burial Island. So some of you might have been down there. And unfortunately, it was a log fort built on a floodplain. So I'll get to that in a second. But first Fort Crawford was built in conjunction with Fort Dearborn in Chicago and Fort Howard in Green Bay. And then because at the time, after the War of 1812, the United States military decided they wanted to keep a military presence along these waterways. And so we have Fort Winnebago here, which was a little bit later, and more in conjunction with second Fort Crawford. But this fort was here circa 1816 to 1829. So being located on the confluence or near this waterway, and this is the artist's representation. Unfortunately, when you have a log fort on a floodplain, it doesn't bode well. So they had constant problems with flooding. The soldiers were shipped back and forth to Fort Snelling and back to Fort Crawford. And by the mid-1820s, they decided they wanted to build a second fort, and that would be on higher ground. So that is where second Fort Crawford comes in. So second Fort Crawford was in occupation from approximately 1829 to approximately 1856. The soldiers were stationed here. The soldiers built the fort themselves. So it took about 5 years to complete the fort. So soldiers kind of were shipped over in the late 1820s to second Fort Crawford. Some were still at first Fort Crawford. And then there's records in the National Archives saying, you know, by 1834, oh, this room still isn't done, or this blockhouse still isn't done. And the interesting thing about some of these, if some of you have ever seen some of these paintings of Fort Crawford, or if you've been to the Fort Crawford Museum, there's never a picture of blockhouses. But the National Archives talks about 2 blockhouses were there, and those were used for defense, as you're aware. So second Fort Crawford was built in parallel to the Mississippi River. So when we were out and I showed you that picture of the road, people were like, well, how come they didn't build it parallel to the road? It's like, well, the road wasn't here. So they built it parallel to the river and the bluffs. So it was comprised of officers' quarters on the northern and southern ends, and then we had enlisted men's quarters or company quarters on the western and eastern ends. And then this is the hospital, which is now the Fort Crawford Museum. And so Beaumont Road came approximately right through here. It used to be called Church Street. And so the soldiers were stationed there until the 1850s. They helped monitor, they helped police the area. They were directly involved with the removal of the Winnebago, or modern-day Ho-Chunk, into the neutral ground in Iowa. They fought in the Black Hawk War. They helped build the fort themselves. They built the fort trail from Prairie du Chien all the way here to Fort Winnebago, and apparently it only took them a few months. It didn't take a lot of time because they didn't. That's what they were meant to do at that time. That's, you know, and they had a lot of daily excursions, and I'm going to talk to you about that in a few minutes. But so the soldiers were there until around the 1840s, and then with the war in Texas, they decided to ship a lot of them out. But then in the early, about 1855, they brought them back, and then they decided to decommission the fort around the 1856 time period. Well, right after that, at that time, people that used to own the property, yeah.
Is it okay if I ask a question? I don't want to interrupt, but you mentioned the Fort Trail. Is that along a known road currently? Like, is there a road that follows that right now?
Adam's probably a better answer for that.
Military Ridge Bike Trail in northern Crawford County, that area, that's the road.
Very awesome. Sorry.
Well, that's okay. And so around the mid-1850s, so after the fort left, the military left, basically what happened is the people that owned the property prior to the military building that kind of had a war about, no, this was my property, no, this was my property, and they kind of fought over who owned it, so they let civilians come in there. And there's records of the civilians kind of damaging things, taking parts of the palisade down, taking some pickets down, taking some of the metal that was in the fort, things like that. And then because of the Civil War, they reenacted the fort and became activated again. And it was used temporarily during the Civil War, and also used for hospital during the Civil War too. So there's various artist renditions of that, of the fort. And you can kind of see here, this is circa around 1864, so during the War of 1812. And this is around 1870. So around this time period, they decided to bring Church Street right after that. So this would have been the Southern Officers' Quarters. This is the Fort Crawford Hospital, which is now a hospital. They decided to bring Church Street and connect it because it was on either side. This military reservation was in the middle. And so they decided to connect it. And this is circa around 1875. You can see that they're missing the roof. You can see that things are starting to get into disrepair. And then here's where they cut off portions of the road to bring it in. So that is now the Fort Crawford Military Museum. It used to be called the Medical Museum until about 20 years ago. Now it's the Fort Crawford Museum. And then here's some pictures circa around 1913 or the early teens. So this again would have been the military. This is part of the hospital. This is now called Beaumont Road after Dr. William Beaumont. And if any of you have ever been down there, this is St. Mary's Academy. It used to be a church school, basically in the late 1800s. They built that on top of part of the fort. And then it was a home for troubled children for a while, and now it's an apartment complex. And this is also around the 1913 time period, so to give you some scale, you can see how dilapidated that is. And what happened is soon after that, around the 1920s and 1930s, the Daughters of the American Revolution took it over and they decided to rebuild it. So this is the Fort Crawford Museum, and it looks similar to that today, a little bit different, but they've added additional buildings. So in archaeology portions in 1933, excavations by Leland Cooper at first Fort Crawford, which again is down on St. Farewell Island, found portions of foundations intact. And so that was a huge excavation in Prairie du Chien. They were able to record lots of information. And at that time, they also did some monitoring up at second Fort Crawford, and they found portions of the palisade under the road. So that is the only type of archaeological excavation that had been done at Fort Crawford until MVAC was involved in 1999. So, looks like a military fort, right? No. So, this is what the general area of the fort would look like when we first encountered it. So we knew from archival research and from those photos, that map I showed you originally, we had a ballpark idea of where the fort was. Artists knew. However, it was hard, we had the soil geomorphologists do some coring here. There was something that happened with DOT that should have been some additional research, but we were out there monitoring. And this is what it looked like at first. And we ended up finding all kinds of rubble, but in one specific area, they kicked up these huge limestone blocks, 2 large blocks. And I said, can you give me a little time? Because what was happening is they were pulling the top, they were pulling the asphalt, and pulling the aggregate underneath it, and then going through and bulldozing, right? Making a nice flat surface. So I said, give me a little time because I want to explore this a little bit further. So we put in test units, which we do to look for intact deposits, and ended up coming down on this, which is a large hand-sawed piece of stone. Perfect. We ended up finding the exact piece that we needed to find, and then as we started clearing that off, we ended up finding a lot more portions of the fort. So you can see, here's part of the foundations right here. So this is the Eastern Company's quarters or enlisted men's quarters, and this is all rubble inside of it. So the fort had kind of collapsed, and then they built over it. So people, all of a sudden, it became this big thing. People came down visiting us constantly. We started working 7 days a week because once we discovered this, there was no data recovery plan in place, and with archaeological excavations such as this, because there was federal money, normally we would have that data recovery plan in place, but this was an emergency excavation. So we had to meet with the City of Prairie du Chien, the State Historic Preservation Office, the County of Crawford County, with DOT. We had a meeting to determine what are we going to do, because the City of Prairie du Chien was responsible for 20% of the costs, and 80% went to the Department of Transportation. So it was decided that because they needed to put the water lateral through here, they had said, oh, maybe we could put it 2 blocks over, but if they were going to do that, they would have had to shut people's water off for 2 weeks, and they didn't want to do that. So they decided to let us go ahead, do an emergency phase 3, so we started working 7 days a week, and it took us about 7 weeks to get everything out. So what the construction crew did, they worked up to us, moved around us, and moved ahead of us. So this is kind of what it looks like as we started taking things out. We had about this much rubble, so we had to use pickaxes and stuff to get through it. And underneath it is where we start finding that beautiful history. And so this is the northern part of the Eastern Enlisted Men's quarters. You can see down here, this is a fireplace, which shows up right here. And then these 2 people that were the last one show up here. And here is that piece that we found originally. And then to the south, up here, we found the Southern Officers' Quarters. So I'm sorry, this is still in the Enlisted Men's Quarters. So we set it up a grid like we normally do. And this, we were able to stand on a ladder and get this great aerial shot. So for decades, people have been driving over this, had no clue. We had, like I said, a lot of interest in the city. A lot of people came out to visit because they felt a heritage to it. They felt it was important to the history of their city. And to the south, down here, is where we have the officers' quarters, and then way down there is the Fort Crawford Museum, which was the old military hospital. So this is the Southern Officers' Quarters. Here's the museum as it is, that is from 1999. And so we found 5 rooms in the enlisted men's quarters and 2 rooms. This is the Southern Officers' Quarters. So here are the rooms that we excavated, and we were able to find some information. So of course we didn't have a chance to do any research until after the fact. So in a way it was good because we had all these artifacts, and when we went to the National Archives, when we went through the data, I was able to pinpoint, oh yeah, we found this, and oh yeah, we found that, and we found this, and it really helped. Normally you do the research before you do the excavations. So, and it ended up we were able to find this particular map at the State Historical Society, and then these are kind of drawings of what we did. So we have the Sally Port, where basically, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes, soldiers came out and they would smoke cigarettes pipes, because I'll show you in a few minutes, we had a prevalence of pipes at the military fort. And so these are the fireplace here, this is those rooms I showed you in the pictures, and then this is the southern, as you get farther to the Southern Officers' Quarters. And then the WL, these are water laterals going into people's houses, so we were able to excavate and take a look at that area. This is the Southern Officers' Quarters. And then also, of course, it happened at 4:59 on a Thursday evening. What did we find? We found a stain. And I said to the construction workers, I'm like, oh yeah, no problem, we'll have this out for you tomorrow morning. Well, it started growing and it turned out to be a privy. So it was likely a privy from either the hospital, or it could have been one of the soldiers' privy. We ended up finding all kinds of information in there. So it was almost dark by the time we were done, because we knew the construction workers were going to start very early the next morning. And again, as I mentioned, we had a lot of public attention. Here's myself giving a tour for a group of children that would come down. They brought all kinds of school groups, and it was a perfect way to educate the public, particularly children in the area. It was a great opportunity for them to learn about their city's past. So, cultural material. So before I get into that, I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the things that from the National Archives, just a little bit about the daily life. I know Adam had kind of talked a little bit about some of the things that we find, and some of the things that would go on in a daily situation for soldiers. So I brought a few clippings that I have from the National Archives that we were able to go and get. And this is from 1824. This would have been actually part of First Fort Crawford, but it kind of gives you an idea, and I apologize, some of these words are hard to read because, as you can tell, it's the beautiful 1800s cursive that can be a little difficult. So this is from March 2nd, 1824. The officers commanding companies will drill the soldiers. Other companies engaged in fatigues during the day, with intervals of not more than a half an hour, except at dinner and breakfast, when there will be allowed an interval of 1 hour. The drills will commence at reveille unless the weather becomes severely cold. The quartermaster will, as possible, admit the fatigued parties at dinner. In order that they may be in the company drills, the police party must be dismissed at the same hour and attend drills. The waiters must also attend drills unless they be well-formed soldiers. The officers will throw into an awkward square the soldiers who appear to be careless in learning their exercises. The commandant is anxious that the officers should embrace the present moment to form their companies. When the river breaks up, all the soldiers will necessarily be employed on fatigues. In a few days, with strict attention to this great change may be effected for the drill of a company. The quartermaster will be held responsible that the out parties under his charge are drilling for 1 to 2 hours during the day. So, simple thing, and for those of you who are in the military, you know about drills, but that's also, again, they're out policing the area. They're helping to build the fort. They're helping to do all kinds of stuff. It wasn't just this is all they had to do. Prairie du Chien, there was a lot of huge population coming in at that time. It's the second oldest city in Wisconsin, and so there was a lot of people that ended up coming into that area. So there's a couple other things as we go through, but just as I mentioned about some of the things they had to do, they had to go procure logs. Okay, so they had to go cut wood for the winter, And there's a little snippet in one of the archives from the 1840s. Well, they were basically talking about that they would have to go out and they'd have these parties of men go out and cut wood. Well, then they'd have to send search parties out because some of the men that were supposed to be cutting wood were deserting. And so they'd have to send search parties out to try and find the men, and then some of those people deserted. And so it became a little bit of a problem. A couple of these I'll save until we get to the next part. Oh, sorry. So, cultural material. So we had a prevalent amount of cultural material. We know that non-military personnel were allowed to live in the fort for about a year in the mid-1850s when those people were arguing about who owned the fort until the soldiers came back. And so we do have some artifacts that are not related to military items, and those are a little hard to piece out. But we have a great amount of military buttons, which was my favorite thing to look at. So here we have the great coat button. This is a spread eagle button, an ordnance officer's button, and then the great coat button. And I'll explain a little bit about those in a few minutes. So some of you, there's a display out there, a beautiful display with some of the military dress that some of these soldiers would have been in. And this is kind of similar. These were more like a dragoon looking. This is actually infantry or dragoon. And mostly infantry were stationed at Fort Crawford. And one thing that the soldiers also did at Fort Crawford, so it was mostly infantry, however, when they built Fort Atkinson in Iowa, the soldiers from Fort Atkinson the dragoons from Fort Atkinson stayed at Fort Crawford while they were building Fort Atkinson. So there's a whole prevalent amount of different types of soldiers there. So this is just kind of a representation of some of the things that they would dress and how some of their dress fatigues would look. So, military buttons. These are probably, like I said, some of my favorites. In the center, we had an ordnance officer's button. So, we have the ordnance right here. You can see it's an eagle and it's holding cannons. So, I had no idea what it was when we first found it. Had it sitting in my office for several months. Took it to Fort Snelling to ask some of the people up there, and one of the gentlemen's like, you know what, at lunch I'm gonna run home and look in my book. And he came back and he's like, oh, that's a pretty rare button. It's worth about $2,000. I'm like, oh, I guess it goes in their safe. So, at that time, and I don't know, we don't look at stuff for monetary value. Obviously, for us it's educational value, but it was just very fascinating. Here you can see we have the scoliated eye, which is for infantry. You have a spread eagle here, and I don't know if you can see it, but there's an eye here. The great coat button was used for all branches of the military, except Air Force, because there wasn't Air Force back then. So, Army, Navy, and Marines use the great coat button. And then also this is a blank face, and so this could have been dragoon. One thing that was very interesting that I learned about second Fort Crawford buttons, and because this fort was built in the 1820s, right, to the 1830s, apparently soldiers reutilized a lot of the buttons that were from the War of 1812 because the Army didn't want to pay for a bunch of new stock when they had all the surplus left from the War of 1812. So some of these buttons are actually older. They predate when the soldiers were there, which was very fascinating. And there's a lot of older books that were written in the 1950s and 60s on this, and there's just wonderful illustration that is just fascinating. So here you can see a close-up here, and we have that foliated eye in there, and this is a forage cap hat. So more of not the formal hat, but more of like a cap that you would put on, and then their A was ascribed to it. So we didn't find a lot of stuff in terms of rifles and materials in terms of the metal, because in Prairie du Chien the soil is very acidic, so a lot of the metal was in very, very poor shape. So there's quite a few things that are unidentified, but we did have a few things, so I just want to give you an idea. We have, for most of it, it was a flintlocks, and but we have the frizzen, which we have one of those, I'll show you that. We have the trigger guard, flint caps, the cap screw, the gun flints, and then the gun flint cots. So, gun flint cap right here, because it's metal, we know it's military. If it was citizen, if it was a private citizen, it would have been leather. So we have a few of those, and we also have the great musket balls, and so we had some 69 caliber, which were military issue, quite a few 54 caliber, which would have been civilian. And again, one thing I should point out, so soldiers also went out and hunted. So food was brought in from various areas. So they would either conscript with locals to bring in beef, pigs, soldiers grew stuff in their gardens, but they also went out and hunted. So they had some elaborate parties. There's stories in some of the literature that the officers would have parties and bring people in, so the soldiers would go out and they would hunt some of the game. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then we also have the gun flints. So we have here, the darker color is the British, and then the lighter, the honey colored, is the French. And that's a whole nother thing in terms of how people can identify those in terms of their size. But here you can see some of the different types of sizes of the musket balls that we found. Here's the gun flints, the flintlock caps, and here's a couple of the cocklocks. And again, you can see that metal is in very, very poor condition. And here's a close-up of the flintlocks, and you can see this one. You see how many times it's been fired? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I mean, it's been used at least 10 times. So that's very, very cool. And then again, here's another photo showing the different sizes. So we have 69 caliber going all the way down. So we have birdshot, buckshot, bear shot. I mean, there's all different kinds of size of shot. And then we also have the percussion caps, which we had a few of those as the transition out of the flintlock gun to the percussion cap rifles were used. Now, most of you probably are aware, flintlock guns are not very accurate. And as they got better with the rifling, things got better. So that's why when you see the old movies from the word, 1770s movies, they're all so close together because they're not accurate unless you're close. And then we also had some evidence of their swords. So the scabbard hook. This is the end of the tip of their scabbard. Would be in their a frog, a scabbard frog, which would help hold their sword onto their belt. And all kinds of different types of ceramics. So as I mentioned, we know that non-military lived at the fort for a period of time. So some of these could be non-military, some of it could be related to the fort, some of it the soldiers. But you can see there's a whole gamut of different things. A lot of these, the pearlware down here, this would go to 1820s, 1830s, the hand-painted pearlware. As you get in, we have a little bit of mocha-ware, and I saw in the other building, Adam, we looked at a piece and I know this is really small, but you're starting to get into some of that, and then you have the shell edge pieces, and you have some angular ware here, more whiteware, and then you have the decorated whiteware down in here and some of the hand-painted pieces. So, and here is a great piece of some of the different types of transfer print. And there's a whole gamut of this when you look up that information. There's been tons of books written about all these styles. So when you look up the style, then you can go back and find out approximately when they were produced. So a lot of it was in England. A lot of them were mass produced after a period of time. So at first you look at it like, oh, this must be really rich people. Well, no, because after a period of time, everybody was making them and shipping them over. So, and here's a few pieces that you can see we puzzled back together. So this great ironstone water pitcher. And then this is interesting. So this is a pearlware hand-painted bowl. And when I was at Fort Snelling, I saw its exact match was there. So that was really fascinating to me because it could have been, maybe it was a piece that the soldiers brought from Fort Snelling over here, or vice versa. Maybe someone from Prairie du Chien brought them into that area. So, pipes. We had a huge amount of pipes, as I mentioned, out in the gallery or boardwalk area. Soldiers that was one of their pastimes, smoking pipes. And so this is a great piece. This is a white clay. People used to refer to them as kaolin. We now call them white clay. This is an eagle, so unfortunately the face is missing. This is the common TD pipe. They're very common during that time period. A lot of different manufacturers made them. There are a lot of different styles. And then these are presidential campaign pipes, and I'll show you in just a minute. So this for Franklin Pierce for president. And this, ironically, Zachary Taylor. So Zachary Taylor served at Second Fort Crawford, so did Jefferson Davis, right? So Zachary Taylor, that's a Zachary Taylor campaign pipe. So, it's interesting that he served there as a young gentleman, and then when he ran for presidency, there was a campaign pipe that we ended up finding. So that is a very particular meaning. And then we also have, here's that close-up of that eagle pipe. You can see it better. Some of the scroll pipe, the TD pipe, and then a lot of just plain pipes without decorations. But we had a lot, and I mean hundreds of pieces of pipes, and a lot of them were broken. So, we could have more than one, but just hundreds of them. So as part of the daily life, as you know, soldiers are all packed in a room, right? So you're all a bunch of people together. So I thought this was kind of interesting. I thought you might be interested in seeing some of this. So we actually found some of the records from the 1830s about what they were suffering from. So you can see there's cholera is one big thing. I got a little clipping about that. Catara, which is kind of like a form of diarrhea, which they have diarrhea up here, epilepsy, fever, fracture, all different kinds of things that, you know, syphilis, sprain, scurvy, all different kinds of things that we suffer from today, but it would have been a lot worse then because they didn't have the antidotes and the penicillin and things that we have. So one thing that kind of plays into that in the 1930s, there's a clipping from the National Archives that two of the blocks and this some commenced, and they are now progressing as fast as they can. So this is when they're building the fort, 1833. They're building second fort. So they're trying to progress it as fast as they can. However, owing to the cholera, which half of the last 10 days have raised as considerably as many as 50 men from daily has been in the sick ward, and during that time there have been at least a dozen deaths. So things would have spread quickly. It's kind of like the flu, you know, when your kid's in kindergarten, one gets it, or chicken pox, everybody gets it. It's the same thing. They're all packed in these little rooms, and so we have a lot of trouble. They have a lot of different diseases and things that they suffer from. And as part of that, we have a lot of medicine bottles, a lot of liquor bottles. So I'll get to the liquor stories in a few minutes here. So the medicine bottles, we had a prevalent amount of there. We know that there was a couple of apothecaries in Prairie du Chien. There was one in Lower Town, which is a little bit farther to the south, so probably about 3/4 of a mile to the south. There's an apothecary, plus this fort was closer to downtown Prairie du Chien, or the upper part of Prairie du Chien, so there's apothecaries up there. And plus the soldiers would have had things shipped in. And so we had a prevalence of that, and we also had various types of liquor bottles. So a lot of these, as many of you have probably seen, or maybe some of you collect old bottles, some of them had the wonderful writing on them, so like Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Cough Syrup. And Medical Discovery, a lot of these, again, there's books that have been written about this, so you can look them up. It can tell you who produced them, when they produced them, and approximately the time period. So it gives you an idea what the soldiers were using and when they were using it, which was just fascinating. And you can see different pieces here. We have some drinking glasses, different types of liquor bottles, and a Chateau Lafite, which is a very expensive form of wine, even today. A little piece of that was there. So a little excerpt from 1828 about alcohol, and I got a couple other stories. So this is one. This one, they talk about basically, I got these mixed up, but basically what they're finding is that, here we go. I have the honor to, this is from 1838. I have the honor to acknowledge the reception of your letter of the 24th, the disappearance of my requisition of the window screens. The requisition was made in order from General Brooks, who desires me to inform you that the soldiers' quarters make the front and rear defense of the garrison, and there is nothing to prevent citizens from introducing liquor through the windows. Before iron bars were placed in the windows, the men were in the habit of escaping through the windows, and now the introduction of liquor is so common that it can only be effectively stopped by the screens. There's various stories in the Wisconsin Historical Collection dealing with liquor in the fort, and again, these weren't necessarily the cream of the crop. You know, these were people that didn't have anywhere else to go, a lot of them, so this is what they chose so they could have a meal and have a job. And so some of them, you know, liquor was in the heart for them, PTSD and things that they went through. But there's stories, there was one story in the Wisconsin Historical Collection of a couple soldiers that were on guard duty. They saw this cat out on the prairie. And it was walking really strange, and they were kind of watching it for a while, and then they were smoking and doing whatever, and they kept seeing it getting a little closer and wobbling really strangely. And then it was getting closer and closer, and so they were curious, like, what's going on with this cat? So they walked out there. And here what it was is it was a cat, dead cat, with a bottle shoved in its inside, and a soldier was pulling it in on a string. So that's why it was wobbling so bad, because it wasn't alive. It was they were trying to sneak liquor in. And there's another story in Wisconsin Historical Collections of a soldier that came in. He had his jacket slung over his arm and it was dripping wet. And one of the guards was curious and hear what it was. It wasn't water, it was liquor. And so he would bring it in, he'd bring it out, and then they drank the liquor. So they sold him liquor. So there was lots of problems with civilians putting liquor into the soldiers, and then because of some of them, we had issues with deserters. They had issues with the deserters and things like that. So just a lot of fascinating little things that you want to think about, but things that went through and that they went through. And so this is a close-up of that Chateau Lafitte. I don't know if any of you are wine drinkers, but a very interesting little piece. So actually I wrote to, we have our French, the lady who taught French at UWL, I asked her to write a letter for me. And so she did, she wrote a letter to the company and they sent us just a nice book. They didn't have any records about it or couldn't tell us information about it, but they sent us a really nice book on the history of the company. So some of the other things that you can see, we have a lot of stuff about daily life. So obviously the soldiers ate. What did they eat? They had, and that's coming up too, but they needed utensils. So we see here we have the bone handled materials. Those are coming from England. A lot of metal, and again, the metal was not in very good shape. So we had a lot of buckles and things. Some of them are military and some of them are civilian. And we also have, we know that the wives of some of the soldiers lived at the fort, the officers and their children. So we do have a few pieces that would be more related to female oriented. And then, here's a couple other pieces. Here's a big lock from the fort and different types of nails. We had all different types of nails. And those, again, there's books that you can tell, are they hand wrought? Are they about what year would the hand wrought nail have been? And, we know that hand wrought nails were mostly, or square nails were mostly prior to 1890. And then wire nails, or the round ones that we have today, are post 1890. But there's a whole gamut from the 1700s up to 1890 of the different stages of the square nails. So those are just all kinds of fascinating information. So horseshoes, anybody know what these are? Ox shoes, very good. Ox cleats because of the ice. So we know that they use oxes also to help bring the things across from across the Mississippi or different areas. So some of the different things, we talked a little bit about animals, talked a little bit about animals and what they were eating. So I'll introduce you a few things. So as I mentioned previously, we know the soldiers, the military bid out for some things, so for beef and for pigs and things like that to help feed the soldiers. So we have a lot of evidence of some of that. So here's a pig snout and fish. The soldiers did a lot of fishing. We have a lot of evidence of that too. And this is a rattlesnake. And so this was actually found in the privy. And so the big joke was, because it wouldn't have been indigenous to the prairie, it would have had to come from the bluffs, did one of the soldiers bring it and put it in there to scare the you-know-what out of one of the officers. But because of the venom pockets, and again, this is one of Dr. James Thieler, he's retired at the university, but he is a faunal expert, so he identified what this was. And it was very interesting when we found our privy, we were like, oh my gosh, what is this? And you could tell it was a snake right away. And then this is a really interesting piece. So this is the piece that we found of a flathead catfish at Fort Crawford. So these are comparative specimens. So this is 8.5 pounds, 15.5 pounds, 28 pounds, and then this. So it's estimated that fish was probably about 4 to 5 feet high and about 70 to 80 pounds. Now it tells you a little bit about the procurement, because today people don't want to live that long, right? They don't make it that big. But back then they did, because they had nobody hunting them. I mean, they had people fishing them, not like the mass fishing like we have today. And I think my thing got out of order a little bit, and then we also have, some of you might know what these are. Lice combs, right? So again, you're talking, you don't have showers, you're in a group together, and you're in these small rooms with a lot of people. Not only does diseases pass around, but you also have lice. So a lot of bearded men. So nice combs, we've had quite a few of those. A nice wooden toothbrush. And sorry, these got out of order a little bit. I apologize for that. And then going back to some of the things that we have with the egg, we have some cow and the pig, and a lot of it's cut. So some of it they ordered that way, and some of it was processed likely right at the fort. And then bird, there's a prevalent amount of ducks, geese, waterfowl, some chickens, and so we know that the soldiers grew their own garden, and there's records in the archives where they talk about, oh, we have to put fences up because the cows and the pigs are rooting around in our garden. So it's likely that they also procured some of this wild. Some of these are wild, but some of them are probably domestic. So again, as I mentioned, officers were allowed to have their families there. So we have this piece, we're hoping this is a military one, an old doll face, so you have the eye, and then the little cheek, and the hair, and then the bone domino, and a bone gaming piece, which is really interesting, because we know that, you needed entertainment there, so they kept each other entertained. And so we also had some coins there. So we know that this fort was built circa 1829, approximately when they started. Soldiers were there until about 1856. Our Americans' coins from there dated from 1828, so 1 year before the fort started, to 1858, 3 years after. So it's a beautiful timeline. I mean, you can't ask for a better timeline of when we found for American coins. So we have the large 1 cent pieces, and again, this is a 50-cent piece, but we had a prevalent amount of the large 1 cent pieces, so about the size of a 50-cent piece today, until that changed in the mid-1850s. And we do have a few of the normal, what we consider normal size pennies. And then we also had an 1827 Republican Mexican coin and a 1762 Spanish Royal. So that was very fascinating. And of course, that we found that on our last day, which that was a kind of a neat surprise. And then beads. So as we know that soldiers, like I said, military, we had some wives were there. We know they did entertaining. And also one thing that the soldiers that I forgot to mention, they also had a library at the second floor Crawford. And there's a whole list in the National Archives about some of the things that the soldiers were allowed to check out, some of the things that they ordered, like the magazines and the books. But going back to this, you can see we had all different types of beads that we found. So this is a bead, we found about 50 of those in the privy, so likely from a necklace of some sort. And we have some different, and again, there's all kinds of books written on these and what they're meaning, and glass beads, but a lot of those are handmade, and some of them could be trade beads because of the smaller ones. And then in terms of Native American presence, we do have a tinkling cone here, a copper earring, which could be native.
What's the cone?
The tinkling cone, right here.
Yeah.
Tinkling cone, what they would wear on their outfits, so if you see them doing dancing.
Oh,
Yep.
Like,
Yep. Oh, sorry. And then we had some pre-contact Native American pieces there also, which is not surprising. It's all over Prairie du Chien, which likely it's all over here too. I'm sure you have them, I'm sure Adam, and I'm sure it's very prevalent in this location. And then over the years since then, we were able to take a look. This is the Yellow River, which is close to over in Iowa, where they were getting a lot of their, built their dam, where they were bringing some of the limestone over, and this one's on the west shade. And so this is what the military fort looked like when we first found it, and this is what it looks like today. They built over it. Now this building is still here, and now they have a parking garage here, but we had to monitor that because Fort Crawford was not only a military fort, but it was part of a burial site. So there was allegedly that they raised it or destroyed it, a big mound group that was there, a large mound, and carted away Native American bones. So because it being a burial site in the state of Wisconsin, State Statute 15770 protects all burial sites, which includes mound groups. And so part of that, at the time that we did the excavation, they hadn't reinterpreted the law. We only had to be out there for what we call catalog burials, or where they knew where burials could be, which could be a cemetery or an actual existing mound. They reinterpreted the law since then, so now we're out on all of these model trains. So we were able to monitor here, and I ended up finding a little bit more of the military fort, the Southern Officers' Quarters. And we did some public interpretations in between then, but there's a lot of fascinating information in the National Archives. There's a lot of information that Adam has on display out here. There's things that I see like, oh yeah, we have some of that, and we've seen that, and we've seen that. But it just kind of shows you never know what you're driving over, right? You never know what you're gonna see, you never know. It's just a fascinating piece of history that would have been lost. And it just so happened that it worked out that we were able to excavate it. Now the other option is leave it in place for future generations. So there's also that, but the western half of the road, we only excavated this half. The rest of it should be intact.
Do they just pave the road right over the top of what you dug up?
Yes.
So
Well,
it's still there then?
No, the foundations are gone because they had to come through to put that water main through. So that's why we were allowed to take it off. So once we were done, we documented, mapped it, photographed it, and then they had to come through to basically destroy that part of it to put the water main in. But that's part of what we call mitigation. So what it is as part of that plan, public interpretation. So now the Fort Crawford Museum has a huge diorama, it has lots of photos of what we did, it has artifacts from our excavation. I can't tell you how many talks I've given on it over the last 25 some years, which is great, it gets information out to the public, but that's also part of, because it was federal dollars involved, and that was the nice part of it, is that we were able to get information and get some of this stuff done in the Fort Crawford Museum is a smaller museum like this one, and able to get some information, some money to help promote some of that excavation. So. Is there any questions? Yeah.
How big was Portage when the fort was built?
No, I think the population at that time, today it's only about 5,000, so it was several hundred, but with the soldiers there, I mean, there's records that the soldiers were anywhere from, I think at the military fort, there was a part, the lowest part that I saw in the 1830s, and their records of population, maybe 60 to 70 at the fort at the time. Most of it was over 200 soldiers. And then the rest of the town, you know, you'd probably close to, I would think, 1,000. 800, but you had a lot of people coming and going. It wasn't like it is today. Everybody was spread out. They had the farm lots. And so people owned here, people owned there, and then things started to grow, you know, all over into this. They had the French fort, they had Fort McKay, and where the first Fort Crawford was built first, and then they had this, so it's a large, a growing curve, I guess. Yeah.
You mentioned, you know, when the military was there, you had the upper town area and the lower town. Is the lower town now Bridgeport, or is it?
No, the lower town is north of that. So the lower town would be, it's kind of hard to explain. Upper town actually used to be over where St. Clair Island was.
Oh, yeah.
And then it's the true upper town.
Yeah.
And then lower town, I guess, would be the southern half of the city. So it would be north of Bridgeport. So the southern half of the city of Portage.
I was wondering if any archaeology work had been done on the site of the very first fort?
So I had some slides in there originally. That was during the 1930s. They did some archaeology out there. And then they've been doing some ground penetrating radar, Dan Joyce, who's done some work out here, has been doing some additional work out there to look for more foundation pieces. So we did some ground penetrating radar, another gentleman and I, at this military fort on the other side of this building. And we ended up finding what we think were some of the northern officers' quarters in the yard there. Hopeful. Any other questions? Yeah.
Was the military from the fort, did they fight against the Sauk Indians when they were crossing the Mississippi with ships and boats?
The Black Hawk War?
Yeah.
Yeah, oh yeah. They were part of it. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned a couple times there was different items in the privies. Do you think that was just thrown in there, or?
It's hard to know. Yeah, but, so I've excavated a fair amount of privies in my time as an archaeologist, and I don't know if I should be proud of that or not. And in that, people didn't have regular garbage collections, so you know that's where people. I mean, you're probably some of your parents or grandparents. You know, where do you take it? You just throw it out in a privy. Who doesn't need it? It's broken. It's throw it away. So it's hard to know if some of that was intentional, fell in. You know, and again, where that privy was related? We're not 100% sure if it was related to the military fort. I think we did find like a military button in there, but some of it could have just been purposely deposited.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Years ago, they had to move the privies as they filled up, so.
Yep, then they moved it next door, and so we only found one, but again, they were only working in one specific area in the road at that time, so there likely was probably more spread out. You know, like, I guess it would be like the long way this way, but that wasn't part of our project, so we weren't allowed to dig there. So there's probably, I can almost guarantee you there's more. Yeah.
So during the time that the military road then existed, connecting these three forts in the region, what was the relationship? I'm curious about the relationship of how much commerce then passed along the road itself at the time versus what commerce would occur on the river traffic.
That I'm not 100% sure. That's an area that I'm weak on my knowledge of. So, you know, I'm assuming that there was a lot of traffic going back and forth besides the military being able to use it. I know, Adam, maybe you know a little more of the history of it, but
That's a spot I don't know much about either. You know,
it's a
the
good
rivers-
question. I'll research that.
The rivers did not get obsolete
Yeah.
by them building the military road,
Yeah.
but
The water was still their main thoroughfare. You know, they still had a lot. They had a Fort Crawford landing. There was still a lot of stuff that came down through the river. So are you talking about civilians, or are you talking about?
Either or.
Yeah, and that's something I don't know about, like how much of the
Because,
civilians
you
might
know,
have used
there's
there.
Port Arthur on the Wisconsin River.
Okay,
Between here and Sauk City. You know, so there's names of towns along the river that have names that suggest they had something to do with river commerce.
sure.
You know, and I'm just curious, once they established the road network, how that compared to what travel on the river itself would have been like.
Right.
Not just in Wisconsin, but also the
Yeah,
Fox River.
that I don't know. I
from the beginning.
apologize. I don't know enough
I
information.
think maybe an indication of that would be, you know, military road, they established that, finished it by 1836, 1837. At that point, there was enough commercial interest in improving the Fox and Wisconsin waterways that people were investing a lot of money into putting canals in, locks on the rivers. So the rivers were still important enough to, probably get more investment than, the roadways. So probably continue to be used.
One thing too, when you mentioned about commerce, there was one thing I forgot to mention. There was a sutler store, as you can probably expect, at Second Fort Crawford. So they had all kinds of things that would come in, and they allowed civilians to shop there. So that kind of helped boost some of the commerce in Prairie du Chien at the time. So.
No Indian artifacts were found?
Yeah, there was a couple that I showed you. Let me back up. So this is part of a biface. Both of these are biface. So a biface is when they would make a stone tool, starts hitting pieces off, and we call them flakes. A lot of people call them chips. Found all over the world. Well, then they'll start working it into more of a shape of a spearhead or an arrowhead. And so these aren't quite to that point. They're not in a perfectly shaped arrowhead or spearhead form, so we call them bifaces, meaning they started working them. So we did find some. Like I said, we find them all over the world, but in Prairie du Chien, they're very prevalent. So it could be that it was there before and the military built around it. It could have been brought in when they did some other work there. It's hard to know if they were exactly there. I don't think, because normally stuff like this wouldn't have been necessarily in the mound, because this is more of a debitage. It's not like a formed, piece of arrowhead or a spearhead, but yeah, so we do have some pieces.
Going back to the military buttons.
Yeah.
You emphasized that some of them had an eye.
Yes.
Okay. Do you know whether that's related to a particular unit?
So you have the companies, and then you have the companies and the units, and within that, at the fort, I don't have that much detailed information in the military records, but there are some books, and I can maybe talk to you afterwards. I can send you an information about a book that I use to help identify some of these, what timeline period they might have used, and it could have been related to specific companies. So it's very interesting. They have, dragoons, so they also have that Cross Eagle one, but then I have a D for dragoons. So to me, it's just fascinating learning all that stuff. It's
associate dragoons with horses?
Yes, so horses, basically mounted infantrymen. So they had a shorter, one have the long rifle, it's a little bit shorter rifle, but yes, mounted infantry basically.
So the fort must have had stables?
Yes, the fort had stables. Yep, the soldiers built the stables. Sorry, it's one of the things. They keep talking and I forget things that are important. They did have stables there, particularly when they were building Fort Atkinson in Iowa. They had to build extra stables for the dragoons that were staying at Fort Crawford during the building of Fort Atkinson. So have any of you been to Fort Atkinson?
Yeah.
If you get down there, it's just an open,
Worth
you can
going
just
to.
walk through at any time. What was that?
Worth going to.
It is, and it's free. You just walk in and you can give a donation, and they have some of the buildings are still standing, stone buildings, limestone buildings. And it's a great little interpretive area. It's worth the drive if you guys are heading down that way.
Is part of the fort still there?
Yes.
Oh, it
Yeah,
is?
It's part of the
Oh.
military fort still there. And then they have some neat signs up, because I was actually fortunately to stop again this year. I hadn't been there in many years. And they have some interpretive signs and things like that, so,
A really good walking tour.
yes. It's a good time to spend a, good hour, yeah.
The Fort Atkinson,
Yes,
is this the one in Wisconsin or the?
Iowa.
That Council Bluff, I think, isn't it?
It's actually near Fort Atkinson, Iowa.
Okay.
Yeah, it's called Fort Atkinson, yeah, so it's about, I guess coming from across, because I'd say it's about an hour and a half from across. It's not too far of a drive, I guess from here would be a little bit longer, but if you're heading that way for something else, it's definitely worth stopping. So, and it's, like I said, you just go and park and you go ahead and walk in and, you can give a donation, there's a donation box there, but they don't have, you can walk through at any time as far as I understand. So,
Any indication that the decision to place the forts there in Portage were related to the lead deposits, or just down the river a little bit?
So the reason that what I read and all the archives information that the first fort was built on the floodplain. They needed that to have a presence, right? Because they wanted it close to the water, because you want people to see you, right? But being that problematic, there was a piece of land that was donated up on the top on the ridge where Second Fort Crawford was built. So I think that had something to do with it more than anything, that they were gonna let, there was gonna be a courthouse there, and then they sold it to the military for a cheaper price. And that was actually on the higher ground of Prairie du Chien, so actually people could see it even better from the river. So I don't know if it had anything to do with the ore, but they needed to keep people there to help monitor the lead mining district.
Okay, because lead obviously was used for bullets
Yes.
and cannonballs,
Yeah.
so.
And there was a ordinance area there too. We had some of the slate, we had pieces of slate, and we didn't know if it had came from the ordinance building or not, because a lot of them had slate roofs to protect from poof, if you had something blow up. But, yeah.
So you showed the foundation outlines
Yeah.
of those buildings. I'm curious if, if the artifact scatter was greater outside of the building or inside the room.
So, I apologize, I'm gonna go a little quick. Ooh. Okay. So, this photo here, right here, this is that thing that I told you that we found first.
Yep.
So this is the galley, or the boardwalk, 10 feet wide. That's where we found hundreds of pipes all along it. Because again, you think of them going out and having a pipe, doing their, walking at night and whatever, and dropping. We found most of them inside of the fort, because there's only certain portions that we excavated outside, because a lot of this, again, was left intact, so this half of the street was left intact. And so that would have been the most that we found was right out there. It was mostly the pipes. And, some animal bone and some pieces of ceramic, things that had been moved around when they did the road and things like that. But a lot of it was mostly found inside the foundations. So, and then capped when the foundations were destroyed, that basically protected a lot of that stuff for decades. So,
And how deep were the footings?
the footings were about 1.5 to 2 feet deep that were left. You saw those photos from the 1930s. Some of those were, from the hospital were a lot larger, at that time. But when they put Church Street in, that's when they mainly, raised the rest of the building. They had talked about how, and then in 1860s, about how it was in really disrepair during the Civil War even, and then eventually it just got worse and worse. And then when they put Church Street through in the 1870s, that's when they basically destroyed the rest of it. So it's a little time capsule. So the 1870s popped right on top of it, and then stayed like that for over 100 years. Any other questions?
Right.
So you talked about like soldiers had diseases and stuff, so did they ever spread that to the Native Americans?
They would have spread it to anyone that came to visit, and
But
so.
I mean, did that like, were they at war then with the Native Americans?
It depends on that particular slide that I showed you, that was from the 1830s, so there wouldn't have been a particular uprising at that time, but that doesn't mean that there weren't small issues going on at the time, so they could have spread it with anyone they came in contact with, depending on how communicable it was, I guess, in terms of, you know, if you have a
But
cold and.
they would have dealt with it the same way.
Yeah, there was a hospital there, and so the hospital
No, I
treated the
mean,
soldiers.
the Native Americans
The Native Americans, you mean?
would have dealt with the disease, because you said there wasn't really any cures.
Right, they would have dealt with their own practices, you know, native practices, and sometimes they might have went to some of those, you know, the surgeons in town. There were other doctors in Prairie du Chien besides the military fort, so.
Your anecdote about Dr. Roman, I've heard that before, the patient with the ported stomach, that the stomach ported, he gave the name, the patient, Old Fustulus.
Oh, old fashioned, that's good. There's a whole book about, I mean, it's just really interesting stuff, you know, you think about something so small, but it changed medical history about how that, you know, you look at the digestive system and how surgeons learned about how things were processed in the stomach and things like that. So, you know, that surgeon served at first Fort Crawford, but that's why they named Beaumont Road after him. And he used to actually be buried in Prairie du Chien, but then apparently they moved him somewhere, and I don't know exactly where. But there's an old mound named after him, Dr. William Beaumont Mound, down on St. Farewell Island. So. Any other questions? Well, thank you all.